Okay, uh, today there will be no drawings or writings because we're gonna be talking about something that is beyond drawings or writings. And myself included, we've tried to put this puzzle of life together, and we keep adding those pieces. We try to find new ones, and we try to figure out the full picture, how the puzzle is gonna be once it's all complete. And this is my journey, and I'm not saying that I have the full puzzle put together, but it's just giving the understanding on how the chase, the seeking, all that is now kind of irrelevant for me. And it's not me being better than anybody. It's just I'm in that full surrender to life. And that's why I'm doing this series, because I feel the life is the precious thing that we have, and the seeking is still the subtle form of violence against to what is now. And we only have the now. So instead of writing anything, I'm just gonna share my journey after my death experiences, where I went heavily. My death experiences only raised more questions than they gave me answers. And I'm gonna explain death later in this series, but yeah, even death experience, they didn't give me that final answer to anything. They just raised more questions. And I went heavily into all the ancient texts, Hermetics, Gnostics. Then I went into all the religious stuff, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, all kinds of different ways to try to understand my own life and my own death experience. So this is my story, and I'm doing it just to show that it is okay to allow yourself to be in the now without the need to seek or change or do anything other than what you're doing. And yeah, so no, we're gonna save the last bit of the marker that we have left for the next video. And I have my flu voice on, so you guys get to enjoy that today as well. So the flu led me into the next video, which will be about healing. So I'm just gonna read to you what I've written down, and it's gonna be a long one, so maybe if you need to get some sleep, this might be a good one. The infinite source in the infinite silence. Before anything could be known, there was not even the question of knowing. Knowledge itself had not yet arisen because there was no separation between knower and known. This is the first wall the mind crashes into. It crashes hard because the mind is a tool built for division. The mind measures, compares, names, and it remembers. The infinite source exists prior to all of that, not above it, not beyond it, in spatial sense. But before it in the deepest possible meaning of the word. There was no awareness of something, only an unbroken reality that had not yet fractured into experience. If this feels slippery, good. You are already closer to uncertainty has ever been. Most spiritual traditions begin too late. They begin with light, with creation, with intention, with a word spoken into the void. But the infinite source is not the light. It does not speak. Light already implies contrast. Speech already implies division. Even silence, as you usually understand it, is the absence of sound. Yet absence is still a relational concept. The infinite source is not silent because there is no sound. It is silent because there is no field in which sound could arise. This is why the ancient Gnostics refused to describe it positively. Every positive description would be a distortion. Every image would be a betrayal. Why do you feel the need for ultimate reality to be understandable? Why must the source of everything fit inside the limits of the very mind it produced? This demand for comprehension is not humility, it is control. The infinite source cannot be controlled, invoked, visualized, or accessed through effort. It does not respond to belief, ritual, or moral performance. It does not reward or punish. It does not even notice in the way you imagine noticing works. And yet nothing exists outside it. So sit with that paradox instead of trying to resolve it. In the earliest Gnostic texts, the infinite source is described only through negation. It is not flesh, it is not fire, it is not time. It is not intellect, it is not being, and it is not a non-being. These negations are not poetic tricks. They are warnings. Warnings that if you think you have grasped it, you have already missed it. The moment you say, "This is what it is," you are no longer speaking of the infinite source, but of a thought form generated downstream. This is why language feels frustrating, even cruel. Truth at this level strips rather than adds. This stripping is not an accident, it is the point. The infinite source cannot be approached by accumulation of ideas, practices, identities, or spiritual achievements. It is approached only by subtraction. When every concept you rely on collapses, something remains. Not something you can point to, but something you cannot get rid of. Have you ever noticed that no matter how thoroughly you doubt, something is still aware of the doubt? The awareness is not the infinite source. It is shaped by it. It's like a shadow cast by something without form. In many traditions, this stage is where people turn back. It feels like nihilism to the untrained eyes. No promises, no visions, no comforting narrative, just the removal of everything false. But this is not emptiness. Emptiness is still a concept. This is prior. The mistake is assuming that meaning must be constructed rather than revealed by absence. The infinite source does not give meaning. It dissolves the illusion that meaning was ever missing. If this feels unsettling, it is because the ego thrives on orientation. Ego likes landmarks, it loves progress. It needs to feel closer tomorrow than it does today. The infinite source offers none of that. It doesn't move, it doesn't evolve, it doesn't improve. It does not descend or ascend. And yet without it, there would be no movement, no evolution, no descent into matter, no ascent towards liberation. Everything that happens does so within, what never happens at all. So pause here. Do not rush forward. Do not try to understand what has been said. Let the words do what they are meant to do. Loosen your grip. The infinite source is not waiting for you to arrive. It has never been elsewhere. What is required is not effort, but the courage to stop pretending that effort is the answer. By the time you say the word God, something irreversible has already occurred. A boundary has been drawn. A figure has emerged. A center has formed around which attributes can orbit. Power, will, intelligence, purpose, even love. These qualities may feel exalted, but they are already secondary. They belong to a stage where differentiation has begun. The infinite source does not possess attributes. It cannot be said to have will because will implies intention towards something other than itself. It cannot be said to love because love implies relation. The moment relation exists, we are no longer speaking of the source. This is why Gnostic texts are often accused of being cold and abstract. They are neither. They are precise. They refuse to confuse the emanation with the origin. What most religions call God is Gnostic terms already a reflection, often a very high one, sometimes even benevolent, but still not the infinite source. This distinction matters because confusing the two leads to a lifetime of spiritual misdirection. You begin seeking the source in forms that are already downstream, wondering why fulfillment never quite arrives. Consider this carefully. A creator who knows itself as a creator is not the ultimate. Self-knowledge requires contrast. I am this, not that. The infinite source does not say I am. That declaration belongs to later stages of reality. Even the monad, the one emerges as the first intelligible principle. The one is already a movement toward knowability. It is already the beginning of a metaphysics. The infinite source stands before even that. This is why it describes as unknowable, unnameable, immeasurable, not as a riddle, but a fact. Across traditions, you can see this pattern repeating wherever mysticism remains intact. In Neoplatonism, the one is beyond being. But even Platonism hints at something prior to that one. A principle so simple it cannot even be called simple. In Taoism, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. In certain strands of Buddhism, ultimate reality is described as unborn, unconditioned, and beyond all dualities. Not a God, not a thing, not a state. There are no coincidences. They are convergent recognitions of the same structural truth. Ask yourself another difficult question. Why does the idea of a personal God feel safer? Why does a listening, judging, responding deity feel more comforting than an impersonal source beyond all relation? Because relationship preserves the ego. It keeps you intact. The infinite source offers no such preservation. It does not validate your story. It does not affirm your identity. It does not take sides. This is why religion tends to replace it with something more approachable, something that can be prayed to, something that can say yes or say no. But this replacement comes at a cost. When the highest reality is personified, authority follows, doctrine follows, control follows. Once the invisible is given a face, that face can be claimed, interpreted, defended, and even weaponized. Gnostics saw this clearly. They understood that the true source could not be institutionalized precisely because it could not be represented. Anything representable could be owned. Anything ownable could be used. This does not mean that the gods, angels, or divine intelligences described in various traditions are false. It means they are not final. They belong to the realm of emanation, not origin. They are expressions, not the ground from which expression arises. Confusing them with the infinite source is like mistaking a wave for the ocean itself. The wave is real, powerful even, but it is not the source of water. Here is the uncomfortable implication. Salvation, awakening, liberation, whatever word you prefer, does not come from being closer to God as a being. It becomes from releasing the need for a being at all. This is not atheism, it is something far more radical. It is recognition that the deepest truth does not stand in relation to you as an object. It is the condition that makes relation possible in the first place. So when you hear ancient texts say that God cannot be seen, that no one has known God, that the divine dwells in darkness, or that the highest truth is hidden even from the heavens, do not rush to a metaphor. Take them literally. They are pointing to the same realization that by the time something can be pointed to, named, or experienced, it is already not the infinite source. And yet, without the infinite source, nothing could ever be pointed to at all. The infinite source is not waiting at the end of the path. It is what remains when the path itself dissolves. Thought did not appear as a triumph of intelligence. It appeared as a fracture, not a mistake, not a fall, but a subtle turning, an inclination towards distinction where none had existed. Rather, thought emerged as the first shimmer of differentiation within the undifferentiated. This is why the Gnostics describe the earliest stages of reality not as creation, but as emanation. Nothing is made, nothing is added. Something simply becomes knowable, where before there was no knowing. This first knowability is not a thought about something. It is the possibility of thought itself, the birth of intelligibility. In Gnostic language, this is where the first eon appears, not as a person, but as a principle, not a capacity. The capacity for awareness to turn towards itself. This turning is infinitesimal, almost imaginary, yet it marks the most significant transition in all of existence. From here onward, reality can be reflected, articulated, and eventually misunderstood. But prior to this, there is no mirror at all. It is crucial to understand that this emergence does not diminish the infinite source. The source remains untouched. The emanation does not drain it. This is where modern thinking often fails, because we imagine causation as depletion. But emanation is not extraction. The infinite source does not lose purity by allowing intelligibility to arise, just as the ocean does not lose depth when a wave forms. The wave does not contain the ocean, but the ocean contains the wave without effort. Across traditions, this moment is described again and again, using different languages to gesture at the same impossible threshold. In Hindu philosophy, it is the moment from Saguna Brahman without qualities to Saguna Brahman with qualities. In Kabbalistic thought, it is the contraction that allows form to appear. In early Buddhist metaphysics, it is the arising of dependent origination from the unconditioned. These are not borrowings, they are convergences, independent mind staring into the same abyss, reporting what can barely be reported. But here is where caution is required. Thought is not evil. Intellect is not the enemy. The problem begins when thought forgets its origin, when it assumes itself to be primary rather than derivative. The moment awareness identifies with its own reflections, the descent begins not as a punishment, but as a consequence. Each layer of reflection increases complexity. In each increase in complexity increases distance from the source, not spatially, but structurally. The farther reality moves in articulation, the easier it becomes to mistake the map for the terrain. How much of your spiritual seeking is actually a hunger for better thoughts, better explanations, more refined concepts? The infinite source does not offer any of these. It offers the ground from which they arise and to which they return when they collapse. This is why advanced mysticism often feels anti-intellectual to those who have not reached its edge. It is not anti-intellect, it is post-intellect. It recognizes thought as a tool, not a throne. The birth of thought also introduces time, not as clocks and calendars, but as a sequence. Before thought, there is no before or after. There is no narrative, no progress. With thought comes memory and anticipation, story and identity. This is not yet the material world, but it is the scaffolding that will eventually support it. Once sequence exists, the possibility of error exists. Not moral error, but misalignment. Forgetting where you came from. And yet, this forgetting is not accidental. It is woven into the structure of emanation itself. If reality is not to be explored, articulated, and known in its multiplicity, it must risk losing sight of its unity. The infinite source does not intervene to correct this. It does not rescue awareness from its own curiosity. It allows the process to unfold because unfolding is not a deviation. It is an expression. So when you encounter texts that speak of wisdom, mind, or word emerging from the source, do not imagine a divine meaning or a spoken command. Imagine a still surface developing in the faintest ripple. The ripple does not negate the stillness, it reveals it by contrast. Without the ripple, stillness could not even be recognized. Without thought, the infinite source would remain what it already is. There would be no world to realize it. Thought is already downstream. Powerful, yes. Necessary, yes. But never primary. When you remember this, thought becomes transparent. It begins to point beyond itself again. And in that pointing, something ancient stirs, not as a memory, but as a recognition that was never lost. If the infinite source is beyond knowing, Barbello is the first possibility of knowing, not knowledge as accumulation, but knowledge as recognition. In Gnostic cosmology, Barbello is not a goddess in the mythological sense, nor a separate being competing for devotion. Barbello is the first mirror, the first womb of intelligibility, the first articulation of what cannot be articulated. To call Barbello mother is symbolic, not biological. She is the matrix in which thought becomes luminous rather than abstract. Barbello emerges not through command but through resonance. The infinite source does not act upon Barbello. Barbello arises as the first still echo of the source. This is why Barbello is often described as paradoxical language, male and female, silence and sound, stillness and motion. These are not contradictions. They are indicators that we are still near the threshold where opposites have not yet fully separated. Barbello is unity beginning to recognize itself without yet fragmentating. In many traditions, this principle appears under different names. Sophia in her unfallen aspect, Shakti before manifestation, the divine feminine before mythology turns her into a character. But it is critical not to collapse these into sentimental archetypes. Barbello is not nurturing in the human sense. She does not comfort, she reveals. She is the first clarity to emerge from absolute mystery, and clarity can be terrifying. To see even faintly is to risk separation. Barbello is often described as the first thought or of the infinite source. But this must be understood carefully. The infinite source does not think about Barbello. Rather, Barbello is the thought itself awakening in proximity to the source. Thought without content, awareness without object. This is why Barbello is associated with foreknowledge, not prophecy or structural knowing. The knowing that arises before questions exists, where the unseen first becomes faintly visible, and where the greatest danger is mistaking the reflection for the light that makes reflection possible. Seeing requires distance. To see anything at all, there must be separation. An observer here, an object there, light traveling between them. Even mystical sight, even inner vision, even the most refined states of perception still obey this structure. The infinite source cannot be seen because there is no distance from it. There is no over there. There is no vantage point. There is no observer standing apart from what is observed. To speak of seeing the infinite source is already to misunderstand what seeing is. This is why every tradition that reaches its own depths eventually turns against imaginary. The prophets fall silent, the mystic speak in negations. The sages retreat into paradox. It is not because the truth is vague, it is because it is too intimate to be viewed. You cannot look at what you are looking from. The eye cannot see itself without a mirror, and the infinite source provides no mirror. It is the condition of sight, not an object within it. Modern spirituality often promises vision, third eyes opening, realms revealed, beings encountered. Some of these experiences are real. Some are profound, but none of them touch the highest reality. They belong to the inner worlds. Subtle, luminous, structured, but still worlds, still forms, still experiences arising in consciousness. The infinite source is not an experience. It is what makes experience possible without ever becoming one. Why do you trust visions more than stillness? Why does seeing something feel more convincing than resting in what cannot be seen? Because seeing reassures the ego that it still exists as a witness. Stillness threatens that structure. In stillness, the sense of being a separate observer begins to dissolve. And where there is no observer, there can be no vision. Only presence without reference. Ancient traditions understood this with startling clarity. In early Christian mysticism, the cloud of unknowing was not poetic metaphor, it was instruction. In Zen, enlightenment is described not as illumination, but as seeing that there is nothing to see. In Hinduism, the highest truth is said to be that by which seeing sees, but which cannot itself be seen. These are not riddles meant to frustrate you. They are precise descriptions as structural limits. The infinite source cannot be visualized because visualization requires form. Even imagining formlessness is still an image. Darkness, light, emptiness, void. These are all mental constructs. The infinite source precedes the mind that constructs them. This is why attempts to picture the source inevitably collapses into symbols. Symbols can point, but they cannot contain. The mistake is forgetting which is which. There is a quiet violence in forcing reality to be seen. It is the violence of projection, of demanding from the deepest truth presents itself in a way that flatters your perceptual habits. The infinite source does not comply, not out of refusal, but out of impossibility. It cannot step back to be observed. It cannot become other than itself. So it remains unseen, not as a secret withheld, but as a presence too immediate to be framed. The fact that the infinite source cannot be seen is not a loss, it is a protection. If the source could be seen, it could be misused. It could be claimed, owned, interpreted, monopolized. Its invisibility is what keeps it free from hierarchy and control. No priest can point to it, no doctrine can capture it, no empire can weaponize it. What cannot be seen cannot be ruled. So when you stop seeking visions of highest reality, something subtle shifts, attention relaxes. The compulsion to grasp dissolves. What remains is not a picture, but a knowing without content, familiarity without memory, a recognition that does not announce itself. This is not mystical spectacle, it is sobriety. And it is closer to the infinite source than all the heavens combined. Silence is not the absence of sound. That is only its most superficial meaning. True silence is the absence of compulsion, the end of need to fill space with explanation, identity, or reassurance. The infinite source does not teach through words because words require sequence and sequence belongs to time. Silence is not what comes after the teaching. Silence is the teaching once all false questions have exhausted themselves. In the earliest mystical traditions, silence was never treated as a technique. It was not something you practiced to achieve an altered state. It was the natural condition that emerges when distortion collapses. The sages did not sit in silence to reach the truth. They sat in silence because the truth rendered speech unnecessary. This distinction matters. One is effort, the other is surrender. The Gnostics understood this deeply. The highest eon is often associated not with power or light, but with stillness, not inertia, but perfect rest. Rest so complete that nothing needs to move. In this rest, there is no striving to become, no urge to manifest, no hunger for expression. Everything that later unfolds does so as gentle overflow, not a demand. Silence here is fullness, not emptiness. This understanding appears again and again across cultures that never met. Tao speaks of the Tao as something that does nothing, yet leaves nothing undone. The Buddha refuses metaphysical speculation and points instead to cessation. Christian mystics describe God as dwelling in dazzling darkness. Jewish mysticism warns that the highest name of the divine cannot be spoken. These are not stylistic preferences. They are acknowledgments of boundary that cannot be crossed by language. How often do you equate spiritual depth with complexity? Silence strips complexity away. It does not answer your questions. It dissolves the framework that made them necessary. This can feel threatening. The ego survives by narrating itself. Silence interrupts that narration. It offers no replacement story. It offers only presence without commentary. This is why silence is often resisted, even feared. In silence, unresolved patterns surface. Identities loosen, familiar reference points begin to fade. But beneath the discomfort lies something immovable, something that does not argue, persuade, or announce itself. This is not the infinite source, but it is the closest you can come without collapsing into mysticism or a metaphor. Silence is the doorway that does not look like a doorway. Religion tends to fear silence. Institutions require speech, creeds, prayers, doctrines, commandments. Silence cannot be standardized. It cannot be audited. It cannot be controlled. So it is often filled with noise and called devotion. The original insight is buried beneath ritual. The infinite source is replaced with endless words about the infinite source. The map multiplies while the territory is forgotten. And yet silence keeps returning in the quiet moments between thoughts, in the pause after grief, in the stillness that follows awe. It does not demand attention. It waits without waiting. You cannot summon it, but you can stop resisting it. When you do, you may notice something unsettling. Nothing happens, and yet everything feels intact, whole, complete, without explanation. Silence is the final teaching, not because it is the highest achievement, but because it leaves nothing to teach. When silence is recognized not as emptiness, but as sufficiency, the search loses momentum. Not because you have arrived somewhere, but because you realize you never left. The infinite source does not speak. It does not reveal itself. It does not appear at the end of effort. It remains what it has always been, while everything else eventually falls quietly around it. Long before doctrines hardened and symbols calcified into belief systems, human consciousness brushed against the same ungraspable truth and recalled in recognition. The infinite source was never confined to one culture or language. It was encountered wherever seekers were willing to follow awareness beyond its own limits. What differs across traditions is not the realization itself, but the courage to admit what cannot be said. Where courage remained, silence prevailed. Where fear crept in, myth replaced it. The sages understood that every affirmation narrows what cannot be narrowed. To say the absolute is light already excludes darkness. To say it is love already introduces relationship. And so they backed away from describing altogether, pointing instead to that which remains when all the predicaments are stripped away. This is the infinite source named only by what is not. In early Buddhism, particularly in the most philosophical strands, ultimate reality is referred to as the unconditioned, not as God, not as self, not as a substance, something unborn, something unmade, and undying, because it persists through time, but because time never touches it. When the Buddha refuses to answer metaphysical questions about origins, it is not ignorance, it is restraint. He understands that answering would reinforce the illusion that the highest truth can be captured by conceptual thought. Taoism arrives at the same threshold from an entirely different direction. The Tao is not a thing, not a force, not a being. It is the way things arise and return without intention. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Not because words are insufficient, but because speech itself implies separation. The Tao does not command the world. It allows the world. This allowance is not positive, it is effortless potency. The infinite source does not rule. It does not intervene. It does not judge. It permits without preference. In Jewish mysticism, The highest principle is deliberately left unnamed. Before attributes, before emanations, before even being itself, there is that which withdraws from comprehension. The tradition warns that to store directly into this mystery is to risk dissolution. Not because it is dangerous, but because it does not support the structures the ego relies on. The sacred texts circle it with reverence, knowing that to define it would be to lose it. Christian mysticism, when stripped of later theological overlays, preserves this same insight. The language of darkness and unknowing is not pessimism, it is honesty. The divine is not hidden in darkness because it is absent, but because it is too close to be seen. The soul does not ascend to God by climbing upward, but by releasing every false image of God it has ever held. But a surrender so complete that the question of vision dissolves. Even in indigenous traditions far removed from philosophical abstractions, this same recognition appears. The great mystery, the unnamable, the source without a face. These cultures did not attempt to personify the origin because they knew instinctively that doing so would invite control. The sacred was encountered in presence, not in portrait, in ritual silence, in reverent restraint, in the refusal to speak where speaking would diminish. What unites all of these traditions is not agreement on doctrine, but agreement on limits. Each at its deepest point encounters something that cannot be turned into an object or knowledge. And rather than forcing an answer, they stop, they bow, they fall quiet. This is the mark of authentic encounter. Wherever you find absolute certainty about the ultimate, you can be sure the infinite source has already been replaced with an idea. So ask yourself, when you listen to spiritual teachings, are you listening for information or for the moment when information fails? Are you collecting explanations or are you allowing them to fall away? The infinite source has never belonged to any tradition. Religion begins where silence becomes intolerable. When the mystery refuses to answer, human systems step in to answer on its behalf. Symbols are created, narratives are formed. Figures emerge who can be pointed to, obeyed, feared, or loved. This is not inherently evil. It is functional, but it is also a departure. The replacement is always more accessible than the original and always less true. Once the source is personified, hierarchy follows. Once hierarchy exists, authority consolidates. Once authority consolidates, obedience becomes virtue. The infinite source asks nothing of you. That is precisely why it cannot be used to organize societies. A God who issues commandments can. A God who rewards loyalty can. A God who threatens punishment can. And so the highest reality is quietly set aside, replaced by something that can be addressed and enforced. This replacement also protects the ego. An invisible, impersonal source offers no special status. It does not choose favorites. It does not respond to flattery. It does not confirm that you are right and others are wrong. A personal God can do all of this. It can validate identity, justify conflict, and anchor belief. In this way, religion often becomes less about truth and more about reassurance. The infinite source does not reassure, it destables. Most people do not want the infinite source. They want meaning, direction, identity, and comfort. The infinite source offers none of these in recognizable form. It offers only freedom, and freedom without structure is terrifying. So religion steps in to provide structure, calling it salvation. The price is subtle but immense. The substitution of direct recognition with belief. This does not mean religion is useless. It means it is provisional. A raft is not a destination. When the raft becomes the goal, the crossing never happens. The infinite source does not compete with religion. It precedes it. It underlies it, and it remains untouched by its failures. The tragedy is not that religion exists. It is that so few are willing to look beyond it. So the question becomes personal. Are you seeking certainty or are you seeking truth? Certainty can be given. Truth must be endured. The infinite source cannot be believed in. It can only be recognized when belief itself falls away. And recognition does not make you special. It makes you quiet. It makes you honest. It makes you unavailable to manipulation. Which is why it has always been easier to replace the invisible than to live in its presence. Most spiritual narratives are built like ladders, step by step, level by level, higher states, higher beings, higher truths. This architecture flatters the ego because it preserves direction and progress. It promises arrival. But the infinite source does not sit at the top of the ladder. There is no summit, no graduation, no final badge of attainment. Awakening in its most honest form is not ascent, it is erosion. When what dissolves is not ignorance alone, but the very structure that believed it could climb its way to truth. Subtraction begins when explanations stop working, when beliefs no longer soothe, when practices feel performative rather than necessary. This is not failure, it is maturation. The mind, having exhausted its strategies, loosens its grip. What falls away first are the obvious illusions: external authority, borrowed certainty, inherited metaphysics. But soon subtle layers begin to crumble. Awakening does not crown you, it strips you. Who would you be without your spiritual story? Without the language you use to describe yourself? Without the framework that tells you where you are on the path? The questions feel dangerous because they threaten continuity. The infinite source does not preserve continuity. It does not care about narrative coherence. It does not confirm that you are progressing. It only remains present and as everything falls is removed. This is why awakening often feels like loss rather than gain. Old certainties collapse. Familiar motivations weaken. Even meaning itself can thin out, leaving a quiet, unsettling clarity. Many mistake this phase for nihilism and retreat. Others panic and replace what was lost with new beliefs, new teachers, new cosmologies. But those who stay discover something unexpected. Beneath meaning there is sufficiency. Beneath identity there is ease. Beneath striving there is rest. The infinite source does not demand improvement. Improvement implies lack. It does not ask you to become better, purer, or more evolved. These are ideas borrowed from systems that require hierarchy. The infinite source does not operate on a scale. It does not measure, it does not rank. What falls away in awakening is the assumption that something is wrong with you that needs fixing at the deepest level. This does not mean ethical behavior disappears. It means it is no longer enforced by fear or aspiration. When illusion thins, clarity tends to express itself as simplicity, restraint, and quiet responsibility. Not because you are following rules, but because distortion requires effort. Harm requires justification. When justification fades, harm becomes difficult to sustain. This is not morality imposed from above. It is coherence emerging from within. Subtraction also dismantles spiritual comparison. There is no one ahead of you, no one behind you, no one more awakened, no one less awakened in the way the mind wants to categorize. There are only varying degrees of attachment to illusion. An illusion cannot be conquered, relinquished. The moment you believe you have surpassed others, something essential has already been reintroduced. Here is the deepest cut. Awakening does not give you answers to life's biggest questions. It removes the urgency of the questions themselves. Not because they are unimportant, but because they arise from misunderstanding of what you are. When that misunderstanding softens, the questions lose their grip. Curiosity remains, wonder remains, but the need for resolution dissolves. So if you find yourself feeling less certain, less driven, less compelled to explain, do not assume that you are regressing. You may be subtracting. And subtraction is the only movement that leads anywhere real. The infinite source does not wait for you at the end of the progress. It is what remains when the progress cannot no longer be maintained. There is no return in the way you imagine it. No journey back through time, no ascent through realms, no final revelation bursting into consciousness. The infinite source has never left, so it can not be re-entered. What changes is not location, but orientation. Attention relaxes its outward fixation. The compulsion to grasp fades, and what has always been present is no longer obscured by effort. This is why the language of return is misleading. It suggests distance where there is none. The infinite source is not behind you or ahead of you. It is not hidden beneath layers of experience like a buried object. It is what allows experience to appear and disappear without itself changing. Returning is simply ceasing to look elsewhere. It is stopping the search that presupposes absence. In this recognition, something profound yet understated occurs. Life does not become dramatic. It becomes ordinary in the deepest sense. Moments are no longer evaluated for spiritual significance. They simply happen. Joy is enjoyed without clinging. Pain is felt without interpretation. Silence is not cultivated. It arrives on its own. The need to frame experience within cosmic narrative weakens. Presence no longer requires justification. You may notice that nothing about your external life needs to change. Life continues. Relationships persist. The world does not announce your realization. This often disappoints those who expected transformation to be visible. But invisibility is the point. The infinite source does not mark you. It does not distinguish you. It does not separate you from others. It dissolves the need for separation itself. There is a quiet humility that accompanies this. Not performative humility, but the simple recognition that nothing was ever achieved. No truth was acquired. No secret was stolen from the universe. What fell away was pretense, the idea that something essential was missing. When that idea dissolves, gratitude arises without an object. The gratitude, not gratitude for something, but gratitude as a tone of being. This is also where the temptation to teach others appears to explain what you have seen, or rather, what you have stopped seeing. Words can be useful, but they can also recreate the very structures that were dismantled. The infinite source does not need representation. Pointing is sufficient. Sometimes silence is the most honest transmission. Nothing more is required. Thank you so much for listening.